Recording has started.
Okay, I'll share
Yeah.
my screen then, yeah? Three, 2, 6. Right, here we go. Thanks for tuning in, everyone. This is quite exciting to see you all. I thought I'd start with this piece, which is named after a Japanese doom band called Ryokuchi. It's a new one that I made just before the lockdown started. It's part of a series of smaller scale wall sculptures that I'm currently developing, which I think of as signs or warning markers. I'm interested in the way that we interpret objects and our surroundings when language is removed, and this was an idea that was heightened for me when I was in Japan in 2014, which is something I'm going to talk about in a little bit. There was something about being completely removed linguistically from everything around you. Being unable to speak, read, or recognise any symbols, and being forced to sort of visually unpack my surroundings by relying on visual clues to navigate and interact with the city. So drawing on that experience, I included a white symbol on the front of this work, which is constructed from reshaped vinyl lettering, and ultimately it's unrecognisable as a symbol. But by including it in the work and suggesting that the work is a sign, there was something about having it there but denying the language that I felt gave this object a bit more sort of power and authority or something. And I think by doing that as well, it sort of forces you to navigate the object in its kind of physical terms and to unpick the sort of physical characteristics of it. So it's got this kind of spiky exterior and this slightly hidden golden foil section behind. This was a piece that I made while I was on my BA, actually. This work is a paper piece, quite small. It started off as a classic origami box, which I spray painted and then reformed to shift the perception of it in a way that still retains some history of its previous shape. I'm quite interested in making lo-fi analog substitutes for digital techniques, and this was a sort of crude attempt to manipulate the object as if it were an image in Photoshop, sort of increasing the contrast between light and dark using black and white spray paint rather than digital editing techniques. I'm obviously part of the first internet generation, and something that I've been quite aware of throughout my life. Facebook was invented while I was doing my BA, and the media department was very trendy when I was at art school, and for some reason I've always been drawn to kind of like the physical side of making. But I revisited this series of works recently during the lockdown, which is why I'm showing them right now. And I made quite a few more because they suddenly felt really relevant again. And it was really nice to post these out to people and connect with people in a physical way. These are all new ones. Following on from this with the spray painted thing, and this idea of doing lo-fi versions of digitization, there are several kind of layers of that happening in this piece too. I used the same spray paint technique with the light and the dark, but it's also partially covering a risograph print showing a picture of an old Venetian terrazzo floor, but I traded the colours for a more modern sort of acidic colours, and then in sort of opposition to all of that, it's sitting on this spiked walnut frame, which is a beautiful wood that's more associated with like fine joinery and furniture building, and those are kind of interests of mine that you'll see popping up as well. The title of this piece is Herald, which suggests that this object is a sign and that something is about to happen or change. I think of all of these smaller wall pieces as warning markers of sorts, as I mentioned earlier. And I've been reading a little bit about the burial of nuclear waste and how scientists are trying to find ways of warning future generations who won't understand our current language about the dangers of what's buried below the ground. I mean, I don't see these works as being explicit translations of how nuclear waste is managed, but that was a useful departure point for thinking about human impacts on our surroundings. And I do think these works feel like signs or emblems and kind of work as, if you think of them as these kind of warning things to unpick. This is another one from the series called Funeral Moth, also named after a Doom band. The other thing about these is I like to think that they're small. Well, they are small. They're all kind of like the size of your hand, small but really potent. And I like the idea that they could hold a whole wall on their own, and there's something sort of quite magnetic and powerful about them. As with all of my work, I try to go on a bit of a journey with the materials, and I try to be quite sensitive to the materials and the techniques associated with using them. This piece has got an Iroko centre. Iroko is one of the African hardwoods, and I used a router to cut this groove in the middle, and then I was sort of playing with the translucency of this yellow masking tape, putting it on a black background with the kind of triangle shapes on the side, and then on a white background in the centre to give it this kind of central luminosity. This piece was made for an exhibition in Leeds last year called Kuroko. It was important for this work to be ambiguous in terms of its materiality and also its subject matter, but I wanted to imply a level of functionality. There are details which suggest vents or connection points, as if the object could actually be a part or a component of a much larger structure, although I deliberately keep it quite unspecific about exactly what that could be. I wanted to suggest this sculpture doesn't necessarily have one particular way up or orientation, so I included these plastic tread pad things on various sides to kind of heighten that idea. And the ambiguity in material is a really important aspect of these works. The material's dyed MDF, but I like to think that the kind of texture and the fabrication style of it makes it reminiscent of a much harder, more robust material like steel or concrete or something. This isn't one of my sculptures, but I thought you might enjoy having a look at it. Basically, I take a lot of photographs, and I'm going to flick through some of them now. They sort of form the source imagery for a lot of my work, and I've got quite a large bank of images. My sculptures tend to draw from a wide variety of referential starting points, which I combine together to create new sculptural hybrid objects. These could be anything from railway bridge trusses, neoclassical columns, concrete barriers, customized cars, tattoos, bollards, buildings, homeless spikes, staging. Often these objects are associated with asserting or diffusing power or restricting behaviour in some way. Okay. This was one of my sculptures at Outpost members show in Norwich last year. I used spray paint on the surface of this. I like spray paint because of its associations with territory, marking and ownership. For this blue, I was using a quick patchy fill technique borrowed from graffiti, and I wanted to animate the surface somehow. I like to think the black shapes feel quite sort of rooted in the space, but the blue section was kind of like fizzing around them or like animated. Pop-up tents seem to be quite a key influence in some of these pieces. I go to a lot of festivals and see these abandoned empty structures stuck in the mud, twitching in the wind. They're really interesting structures with two ellipses that kind of twist into each other. And also I think they're really interesting volume for sculpture to occupy, somewhere in between furniture and architecture. The large curvy sections of these works are made using foam board, which is a material architects use for making models and displays. With these works, once they get to a certain stage, I like to bind the shapes together as a whole by painting them with different techniques. And also customization is a key stage in the making of these works. I've always been fascinated by the way people choose to model and customize their environments and surrounding commodities and assert themselves in their environment. I used vinyl stickers to punctuate the surface of this piece. You can see one sort of chevron style in the top there, and also bespoke MDF sections that fit inside and interrupt the shape of the foam boards. Yeah, and different paint jobs for different sculptures. This work is called Bong Ripper. I customised this work by spray painting these arrows on the surface. In contrast to the Kuroko sculpture with the plastic treads, this work does have a specific orientation, and the arrow symbolises this. They're normally sprayed directly onto the surface of packing crates, but not onto the art itself. So I use them directly on the sculpture to encourage a different relationship with the subject, like something you would use rather than something you would simply look at. They also sort of sealed the object for me. It's like the last sort of finishing touch. I'm originally from Southend-on-Sea, and there's a particular cultural history there of people driving along the seafront with these souped-up cars with big engines, sound systems, and body kits. I was never particularly involved in that scene as a youngster, but I was always pretty curious about it. This sculpture's got my sort of lo-fi sculptural take on the iridescent car paint that you sometimes see on those customized vehicles. But this is my sort of lo-fi version that I made using layers of leftover floor protection plastic. I basically layered up blue and red, and it created this kind of deep oily purple. There's also a layer of risograph prints underneath all of that. In some ways, my time growing up in Southend really informs a lot of the work I make. I referenced the sort of boy racer culture just then, but I also like to reference other subcultures in the work too. And you may have noticed that a lot of my titles are named after bands. These tend to be mainly from niche genres of metal, such as doom, sludge, and crosspunk. Although the band connection might seem slightly removed from the sculptural subject matter, I like the idea of the additional layer of symbolism it brings and a different sort of relationship rather than the kind of thought-heavy process that goes into the making side of things. There's something about the way the bands settle on their names to do with evoking a feeling or style of the words that I'm drawn to, and I think people have a different connection to titles like that. I showed this piece alongside the last piece, Bong Ripper in Leeds. This is called Lightning Bolt. In many ways, it's quite opposite to the other piece, where Bong Ripper has the arrows assigning its orientation. This piece has been, I'd actually been researching objects that required no fixed orientation in order to achieve their designed purpose. So one thing that I'd been looking at was these static anti-tank obstacles called the Czech Hedgehog, which you might recognise. I know Nathaniel knows what they are because we've had this conversation before. But they're basically like these kind of steel crisscross of beams that will still remain functional in creating a barricade, even if they've been rolled over in an explosion or something. Other objects like this without any orientation that I was looking at were tetrapods, which are coastal defence structures, which you get in big groups and clusters along coastal areas. And the idea is that they force the water to flow in and around them and sort of disperse the energy in the waves. So I combined quite a few design elements from these objects into this piece. One example would be the scale, which is 1.4 meters, which is the same size as one of the sort of World War II tank trucks. I wanted this work to feel quite assertive in its composition and confident of its own strength. But I wanted to undermine these qualities by using unsealed, dyed MDF for the construction and not robust steel or concrete. I use MDF quite a lot in my work, as I often have it left over from carpentry jobs, but I really like dyeing it myself rather than using pre-coloured material because it reveals inconsistencies in the making, such as glue spots, which you can kind of see around some of the joins there. Also, although these pieces look really fabricated, a lot of the joints are actually cut by hand and joined by hand. And when you investigate it, you can see little clues to this once you get up close. I watch a lot of YouTube carpentry videos, and I think when I've been making this, I was learning about how to fit skirting boards in high-end houses, and there are lots of interesting angles going on. The other thing about the MDF is I also have this problem sometimes where new artworks feel too new. So another reason for dyeing the MDF myself is that the colour's less stable, and I find I often prefer it slightly once the surface has faded a little bit. So it looks more in tune with the rest of the world rather than being this super slick art object. The brick hang in the middle really centered this piece for me, and I feel it animates the black MDF sections around it. Also, the fact that it's been eroded by the sea seemed to resonate well with some of the influences in the work, as well as thinking about this concept of time, like the time it takes to erode something like that, the time the MDF takes to age. And yeah, the other thing about having it hanging in the center is it also felt quite bodily, like a heart or an organ or something, and I like this sort of feeling of vulnerability that brought to the work. Right, so I started off talking about Japan, and we're back in Japan now. After my degree show at Slade, I was really lucky to receive a boys' travel scholarship, which funded a research trip to Japan. I wanted to learn about Japanese temple carpentry, but I was also ended up staying with Musashino Art University in Tokyo, making work for a show in their sculpture department. And this is the show here. I think of a lot of the works in this exhibition as quick sculptural notes because my time was quite limited while I was there. So they're sort of quick notes about my observations and experiences learning about carpentry in Japan and being submerged for the first time in such a different culture. I came across this technique called Shusugi ban, which is I've since realised is actually quite popular in this country as well. But it was really popular, especially around coastal towns, on the cladding of buildings, and they would burn the outside of the wood. And I was drawn to it, so I burnt this sculpture. I was really drawn to this dichotomy between the aggressiveness of burning something and the idea that actually it's about protecting what's underneath long term. And the charcoal creates like a barrier in the same way as paint does if you paint your house. So yeah, I'll show you, these are some of the other artworks that I made when I was out there. When I'm deciding how to work in a space or with a new space, I quite often like to take a picture of an empty area and then photocopy it or print it lots of times and draw on it and kind of sketch out ideas that way. So for this exhibition, I took some pictures around the university and decided to show them for the first time. So they were just sort of marker pen quick sketches of ideas. 2 years after Japan, I had a second big trip, um, and I did a residency and exhibition in Senegal in West Africa. There's a project called TAWI, which stood for Tukey Artist Workshop International. Both of these trips were a really big culture shock because I'd never really travelled or left Europe before. In leaving the country for a slightly extended period to work rather than skim a culture as a tourist, a big consideration was what can I bring or what can I offer to the show when there's little or no money for shipping sculptures from the UK, and also when I wouldn't have access to any of my usual familiar tools or systems for making. The exhibition space, as you can see here, was actually half built when we arrived. You'll see there's no window in that hole in the wall, and there's no door frame or door there. And basically, when we got there, there was this forest of sticks holding up the ceiling where they'd been casting the concrete just before we arrived, and they were just starting to take them down as we came in. But there was something kind of really beautiful in the sculpture about all these sticks propping up the ceiling, even though they're not designed to be art. But I just quickly asked them to keep a couple up, not really knowing if I'd use them or what I'd use them for. But yeah, so I kept a couple there. For me, I needed to strike a balance in the work between making something that resonated with the environment whilst not just simply like a magpie appropriating aspects of the local culture and showing it back to them, things that they're already extremely familiar with. When I'm working away from my usual comfort zone like this, I normally try to think about what's important for me about being in this place. So many of my interests tied up in interpreting surroundings and encouraging others to enjoy a shift in the way they're perceiving their environment. So what I ended up doing was I painted some geometric patterns on the two sticks that I asked them to leave. And these patterns were relating to tiles that I'd seen on the facades of buildings in some of the cities and towns that we visited. And as I mentioned before about using paint, the paint was a way to kind of bind these sticks and breeze blocks together and to give them an importance as objects, and elevate them from simply being a means to an end in propping up a ceiling. I hope that these sculptures sort of encourage people to look again and unpick what's in front of them and around them, whilst also acting in the same way as my work in Japan did, as a record or journaling what I was interested in learning about while I was there. This was a commission that I did a few years ago for UCL Art Museum. A really key thing with this piece for me was the idea that something can be massive but also quiet and on the periphery, not like a big kind of loud shouty sculpture, kind of the opposite. And I really wanted, this exhibition was for the relaunch of the gallery space there, and I really wanted to bring a piece that was had some kind of balance with that environment, and yeah, this kind of seemed to, this is what I settled on. I should say it's plasterboard actually, and I'm going to show you a few other plasterboard things now. A few years ago as well, I was also commissioned with an artist friend of mine, Frank Kent, to make an installation in the West Yard space for the Royal Academy. And the West Yard space is normally out of bounds to the public. It's in between the Royal Academy that's on the right there and the Burlington Arcade, which is on the left. And the West Yard is just behind that orange curtain, which was Frank's artwork. Yes, so Frank put these curtains in, and he was really thinking about framing my piece with his, and also kind of setting the boundaries for this experience in this unusual spot. We were both interested, this was my work, we were both interested in experimenting with scale and playing with the long distances available to us in this space, and also making something huge this sculpture was 3.3 meters. It's making something huge look really small and model-like from a distance. So the West Yard space used to be a road that ran the whole length of the Burlington Arcade, basically. It's a really interesting and also challenging space to work with. Logistically, both walls either side belonged to listed buildings, so we couldn't fix into them in any way. And the wall on the left, I'm told, is the longest brick wall in England without a window, which is quite an intimidating thing to show a sculpture next to. One thing that I was really interested with the space was that all the decorative architectural features that are so prominent along Piccadilly stopped with the line of sight from the road. So you can really see, if you look at the top of this image, you can see the Portland stone up high above where the doors are, but everything behind it that's out of view is this kind of like old sort of standardized brick. It's really like a completely different space behind the curtain. And so I guess my piece was like an attempt to sort of subvert the glitz and the glamour of Mayfair and the opulence of the architecture there by creating these 3.3 meter arches and columns, and yeah, using plasterboard, which is usually hidden within walls under layers of paint and never exposed to the elements as a finished surface. This was the sort of second installation of it back in my old studio, and yeah, I just put this in because it was just like it kind of shows how much the context and the environment can really change the feeling and relationship to a work when it's something this big enclosed by a small space. These were some other columns that I made more recently for a show called Ocular Ink at Thameside Studios in Woolwich, which was curated by Hot Desk. And this show was based around ideas of work and labour, so I was really thinking about this sculpture as being part of a work environment or some kind of like machinery environment. This was my degree show. I shared the room with Lauren Keeley, who I think might be on this call as well, and that's her painting on the left. So these were the first columns I made. Yeah, it was my degree show at Slade, and it was echoing the colonnade outside UCL's portico. If you've ever been to Slade, you'll know exactly the columns that I'm talking about. They're really prominent. But where the portico is a display of power and demands attention, these were supposed to be more discreet and rough around the edges, and kind of undermining that authority with cheap materials, plasterboard and wood. There's also a second piece in this picture that I want to talk about, which is called 5 litres of black paint. And so the thing about this, one amazing thing about the rooms at the Slade is they've got a really rich history. Before the art school, it was mainly science labs, and the noble gases were actually discovered in some of those rooms now that are current artist studios. There are a lot of clunky areas in the room where it's been adapted to suit these different functions, and the black paint for me was a way of taking ownership of all of this sort of visual clutter. And the other thing was that at that time I'd actually painted my studio black as well. I was sort of questioning why white is the standard baseline colour for galleries and looking at art, and I decided that I really liked black as a backdrop, and once it's painted, it really didn't feel as sort of radical as it sounded, but it's still kind of like a nice, good, clear backdrop for looking at art, I think. So as I mentioned earlier with some of the drawings, my approach to working in a space often starts with taking photos of an empty room and then sketching ideas and compositions over the top. That's normally a private part of my work, but it also led to this series that I call like the hypothetical object series, and these were paintings on photographs that were sort of materially and structurally the objects didn't have to make sense, so there was kind of like a freedom with what I could do. I'm very lucky to work for a really beautiful gallery from time to time. The gallery is called Kate McGarry in Shoreditch, and Kate was very kind to let me document the empty gallery once when we were in between installs, and I printed out the photographs and then sketched and painted these objects on top of them. I've already shown in such high-end spaces like this myself, but this body of works is quite liberating in terms of being able to think through a range of spaces in terms of such clean, crisp backdrops and dreaming about making on an epic scale. Going back in time here, this was in 2010. This was a commission for a musician friend of mine. This was the album artwork for Get Cake, Wear Cake Fly's third album. And yeah, my friend Joe helped me take a picture for this. And in some ways, it was sort of like the first photograph that, it was the first time that my artwork had really made like a photographic format, as like just on its own without any kind of like folding or painting or but there was just something about the way we shot this head on, really flat, symmetrical. I like that, you know, there's no sense of scale with the object there, and the only thing that gives it any perspective is the floor. So yeah, this was it. These were the CD, and the on the left is the single cover that was released from that album. The key thing about this artwork for me, though, was that it was sculptural artwork. So the sleeve of the CD actually folded up. This is my promo copy that's been folded many times, but it was actually an origami piece, and this was what kind of got me into origami in the first place. And so yeah, you can see Sam's lyrics on the inside there, and it folded up basically to make the sculpture. This is a terrible picture. I just took it on my kitchen counter this morning. But so yeah, the idea was that you could fold up. I mean, the instructions are pretty ambiguous. You'd have to be quite persistent to get it, I think. But it was possible to fold up this object and create a physical sculpture for the CD to live in, and the CD fits just behind the flap there, and you can see it's got this kind of glow of like red material on the other side. And so yeah, it was just, for me, it was really important to make like a 3D object as an artwork for something that's normally flat. But then yeah, luckily collaborating with Joe, we got a really good photograph as well, and that's what people see on Spotify if they haven't got the album. I work quite regularly over the years as well with a sound artist called Stuart Bowditch. That's him on the corner tinkering with my sculpture. This was a project that we did together called Fugu. Stu basically connected an array of transducers, contact mics and other electronic components which made the surface of the sculpture vibrate with a unique audible tone. He then sampled this sound live and used it to create a layered soundscape. This picture was taken at an experimental sound festival in Belfast called Sonorities. It was really odd having a stage time for a static sculpture. I think people were expecting it to light up or move or something. But the idea for us was about experimenting with ways of bringing a duration to a static object and helping people to gain a deeper understanding of it through spending more time. If you think about in galleries and things, people often just look at an artwork for a few seconds, and we were trying to encourage them to kind of really build on that. So this was another outing that it had to May Project in London. We used real turf for this, and it was actually during a heat wave. It was really hard to get grass that green. The person that sold it to me said it was the greenest grass in London. But yeah, so the piece was called Fugu, and a fugu is spelled F-O-G-O-U. They're basically these ancient underground structures that are found in Cornwall. They're similar to Irish souterrains, sort of similar era to Stonehenge kind of thing. And the thing about fugus is that they're really ambiguous in terms of what they were used for. There are theories around like shelter or storing food and this kind of thing, but the main theory is that they're used for some kind of ritual. So with this piece, we were trying to draw parallels between those kind of ancient rituals and modern day rituals of going and seeing live sculpture, artwork, music, all of these things. And so in the sculpture, I used visual markers from the live music industry. Like there's a speaker cabinet handle there, and the whole thing was tied together with a ratchet strap, which is how you quite often see that at the side of stages. They'll strap the speaker stacks together to stop them from falling over. And then because it's supposed to be an underground thing, a fugu, it had this dark hole on the bottom, which was actually a black vinyl dance mat. And I just put this one in because this was at Union Chapel, and it was just the most amazing plinth that I got to use once. This was a piece called Truss, and I put this in because it's another sort of sculpture that travelled around a bit. This was originally a site-specific piece made for News of the World Gallery in Deptford. My photography skills come on a little bit since I've documented this one. Sorry about that. In some ways, like the columns that I mentioned being sort of large but also discreet, I was thinking along similar lines with this, and trying to do like quite a subtle intervention architecturally in the gallery. I like the idea that people had to walk underneath it to get in, and still lots of people missed it. There was another burnt wood piece. After that, I took it to a music festival. Truss is the shape with the sort of zigzags contained in rectangles, and it's basically like a really strong shape that you'll see in railway bridges, lots of different roofs of wide spaces around staging. So I took it to this music festival and had it kind of ratcheted together like this with hazard tape around it, as if it's just been left kind of abandoned off the back of a truck, like it never quite made it to the show on the stage. And then, lastly, it ended up in a show in Southern. At that time, it was quite intimidating showing in such a slick gallery, and I think there was just something about bringing this kind of like dirty burnt wood piece there that seemed to be, like a reaction against the kind of clinical environment that the sculpture ended up in. Right, so just to finish up, I thought I'd show you a couple more things that I've been doing in the lockdown. I was involved in this really interesting project instigated by a writer called Anna Suter, and the idea was that she wrote undated diary entries, then sent them out to artists and poets and things, and then everyone that received one had to kind of respond to it in some way. So this is the text that Anna sent me. As I've been sitting here, I've been seeking something. We are continually seeking and changing. I reach for it in the darkness, like a tongue worrying at the rough edge of a broken tooth in a wet mouth. What am I seeking? Perhaps it's poetry, the singing of plants, the living hum of the earth, the Orphic melody in everything. To pass through a verdant song in calm confusion and feel the insistent pull of the present, like a magnet drawing the pale jelly of my eyeballs, the mobile solidity of my kneecaps, the branching neurons of my brain. So Anna sent me that, and then this was my sculptural response, which was kind of like a flat pack sculpture in two parts. The rule that it had to be able to go in one envelope with one stamp. So these were sort of two hinged parts that slotted together. And I was kind of drawing on other ideas with some of my bigger works about, the orientation. But for me, there was something about creating like some kind of magnetic object that I thought might be really good for this project. And then this was my sort of pathetic drawing that I sent her to try and describe to her how to put it together. These are some more smaller things that I've been working on in the lockdown, and I've had this idea for a little while, thinking about travelling and things, to make smaller sculptures that could potentially be parts for bigger things. So I guess these kind of occupy that. And yeah, I got into using these earplugs. I really like the combination of this kind of this bright orange sort of marking colour piercing the dark MDF. And yeah, lastly, I thought I'd just finish with a picture of my studio. So there we go, all done. Shall I stop sharing the screen now?
Yeah, please. Thanks, Jon. I'll just put everyone on gallery view as well for questions. So everyone should be able now to unmute themselves for questions. We've lost.
I'm just opening a beer while we do that. I've earned it now.
Right, Jon, I thought my first question could be, what beer are you drinking? Can you tell us a little bit about your fancy tin of beer, please?
Yeah, this tin of beer was a birthday present for my sister. It's Isolation IPA from a local brewery, and it was like a fundraiser beer for the COVID situation. Quite tasty, actually.
And does anyone have any questions? I don't know why I keep losing your visual, Jon. I don't know what's going on. Maybe.
All right. Did it drop out in the talk?
No, not at all. It's just doing it now, so that's weird. Anyway, hopefully that's better.
Yeah, I had a question.
Go for it.
It was really interesting getting more of an overview of your work, and I was wondering, in terms of those source images and those kind of like objects and structures that you photograph and find inspirational. I mean, you said a little bit about what you felt was a common thread between them, but there's a lot of stuff that's really, really different within that. I was just wondering if there was like one or two specific kind of like commonalities within all the stuff that you find yourself drawn to that you could tell us about.
Yeah, okay. I mean, they are pretty broad. I guess I'm really fascinated by the way people manipulate their own environment. So I really like kind of quick fixes. I think farms are really good for those kind of like sculptural things. You know, like where people have kind of repaired a gate in like a really interesting way or something, and because you know fixes like that are everywhere in cities as well, and so I guess that's one kind of thread. I've realised recently that a lot of the images relate to like kind of like power structures in some way. So like things like aggressive forms of architecture, like homeless spikes and skate stoppers and sloped ledges and things that are kind of, I'm interested in things that are often quite subtle as well, like a lot of bollards around like high-rise buildings and things are actually kind of disguised as flower beds and that kind of thing. So there are those kind of layers to it as well. And I guess another side of it is probably the relationship with nature. So I find myself quite drawn to different textures and things, and not that nature particularly features really heavily in the work, but there's definitely something to do with the textures that, and thinking about the sort of humans in relation to the environment that they occupy that's in there as well. So yeah, I guess there's a few threads, but when I'm taking them, I try not to think too hard about whether this fits with, you know, what I'm trying to get out of it. You know, if I see something I like, I just won't think about it. I'll take the picture and then, you know, see how it fits in later.
Yeah, I can get behind that, folks.
Yeah.
Do you have any other questions?
Don't be shy.
Jon, can you talk a little bit about if you do you have any upcoming projects? I know it's a bit of a weird time for that, but
Well, yeah, I just got a phone call from my friend Dan last week saying that the project in Serbia that we were supposed to be doing in September is actually still happening. So we're
Oh,
thinking about that at the moment. And he's got this really brilliant, well, before COVID hit the world, he had this really brilliant idea of driving across Europe to get there and sort of thinking about the size of Europe and the fact that we're leaving the European Union and all these things. So if we can make that show happen, it'll all be going in his car, and he's going to spend a month driving through all these countries. And in some ways, to me, I'm really excited about that because it feels like even more relevant, the fact that everyone's been in lockdown for this whole time and that we're going to make this kind of heroic effort to get over the other side of Europe with lots of weird physical objects. But so, yeah, hopefully that will happen. And I'm not sure if Dan's listening, but I'm quite excited if it does. And then, yeah, there's another project that I've just been asked to do that's going to be in Greece next year, which is another residency. I've been put in touch with another artist there, and the idea is that we start to we start like a discussion now, and then figure out the form, whatever form the sculpture and the shows are going to take further down the line. But yeah, so there'll be like a bit of an email sort of video call conversation, I think, there. But yeah, apart from that, kind of quiet and just sort of tinkering away in the studio, trying to make a new body of work. I'm currently thinking quite a lot as well about these like shipping buoys that you see in the sea, and about these port and starboard and the way they kind of mark directions around different territories and things. So there are some of those ideas floating around in the studio at the moment.
nice pun. Can you talk a bit about your odds project as well? I think it's a really nice example of a really interesting like do-it-yourself approach to a show.
Yeah, someone described Odds to me as the best show the world has ever seen, and
was that one of the
it,
artists who was in it?
Ever.
no, well, yes, he did show something in it, and but there was a lot of enthusiasm for that show, and I think rightly so because it was a really
Yeah.
fun thing to put together. But for those that don't know what Odds is, occasionally I organise exhibitions, and Odds was one that grew sort of quite organically with a couple of artist friends of mine, Robbie Fife and Angus McCrum, and it started. It really started with a conversation about the sort of peripheral objects that artists have in their studios and things that we make that we kind of cling on to, but don't necessarily make the cut as an artwork. But they might follow us around as we move studio 3 times and then end up in someone's flat or blah blah blah. So it was about these kind of important objects that aren't the work themselves, but they're sort of sidelined in some way. And we did the first Odds was in I think 2017 in Robbie's studio, and we started inviting some artists, and we thought as well it's a really nice way, a nice sort of informal way to connect with artists globally. So people were sending things in from all over the world that were really precious to them, and then that show we had about 35-40 artists in it. We hung everything on just on one wall on shelves. And then Odds 2, which is the big one that happened last year, I think we ended up with about 85 artists, and that was a really fun one for lots of reasons. One reason was that it was in a shopping centre, so there was sort of no hierarchical barrier for general public in terms of like being intimidated by white cube galleries. It was just in a kind of everyday space. And there's a really great art school in Southend called Toma, which is like a sort of independent sort of DIY art schools, a similar kind of setup to, I guess, School of the Damned and Open School East and one of these kind of situations. But the one in Southend is really cool, and they've been really active throughout the lockdown and stuff. But this was Odds launched a new project space there for them, and we one reason for doing it there was because bringing like 80 artists and then all that kind of exposure, it felt like a really nice way to connect with them and kind of put their project space on the map. And also I just love the ethos behind those kind of DIY art schools. But yeah, if you want to see pictures of Odds, I think there might be a few on Toma's website, which is something like Toma-art or something like. You Google it, you'll find it, and or on their Instagram. There's, for a little while you'd have to scroll back a bit, but I made an effort to post a picture of everything that was in that show. So there's probably about 20 different posts, all with like 10 images on. But if you're feeling really studious, you can go back and kind of check all that out. It was a really fun exhibition. Not sure what Odds 3 will be. Maybe it'll be something completely different in the back of my van or something. I don't know. Yeah.
Sounds good. I'm looking forward to it.
There's going to be loads of empty buildings coming up, like as a result of COVID. I mean, it's like half of Cardiff town centre is already empty. I feel like it's going to be a lot of opportunities for using spaces like that.
Are you going to host this, Jen?
Maybe, yeah. Bring it to
Odds on tour.
Do you see it as part of your practice?
There's something that I think is really important about a kind of wider career side of that, in that I think as an individual artist, it's really easy to feel like you're kind of an island on your own, just kind of, especially if your studio's on your own, you're just kind of doing your thing and you can kind of get sucked in your own little world. And so I guess organising shows for me, and also working as a technician in galleries and things, is really important for like connecting with other people, and I think that's kind of vital. So yeah, and then obviously projects like Odds, when there's 80 artists involved and lots of different organisations and things, it's kind of they're kind of quite life affirming moments when you realise that there is this like really big network, and everyone's kind of into it, just in like a pure kind of no money kind of way. But I guess that didn't really answer the question. I don't see it directly as part of my work, but I think the other thing about helping other artists show their work and install it and things like that is that I feel like I've got quite a lot of experience in dealing with different situations that I didn't necessarily have to go through as an artist myself. So I kind of feel like sometimes when I encounter a difficult situation myself with an install, I'm already quite well prepped for it, just because of the working in that environment. But yeah, not really in terms of a direct thing with my practice, but I do really appreciate working with other people.
That was really great. I thought, it was a really great thing to bring everyone together like that. And also the show, like, to have that many number of artists in a small space is a really challenge, but the way that you put it together, the way that it looked, with the kind of scale of objects together, I just thought worked really well, which is really hard to do, I think. But yeah,
well, I guess the other thing about working in galleries all the time is that we felt like we were allowed to break the rules. So we deliberately kind of came up with our own support structures for that show and made everything as sculptural as possible. But we didn't feel like we were being inconsiderate towards any of the objects. It was almost like hyper considerate, but just, and there was something about this kind of trust that all the artists put in, where, we didn't ask for any installation instructions because it wasn't technically artwork, most of it. So we had a lot of fun with that. And, we had some beers while we were thinking about how to place everything, and that was a really nice process. Anyone else got a question?
Any last questions?
Have you any plans to do to do a odds three? That in the pipeline?
I would, yeah, I'd love to do an odds three. It just depends what situation comes up, really, because obviously there's a bunch of artists organising stuff. We don't have any money to do these things, and it's we pay for that in our time. So yeah, there needs to be like the right space, and it needs to feel like the right context, and yeah, there are a couple of ideas in the pipeline, but I'm not going to give them away just yet.
Fair enough.
I'm sure there'll be odds three at some point. Maybe it'll be in Mexico City or something, who knows? or Cardiff. Jen's offering.
I think Mexico City.
Plenty of places here, I think, because I think a lot of shops are not going to be operating for much longer, unfortunately. So I think there'll be a lot of spaces, probably some different spaces too.
Yeah.
Maybe quite a lot of artists have done quite a lot of isolation work, so the opportunity may be there to show stuff which is slightly different from what we've normally had.
Yeah. I mean, well, the other thing about putting exhibitions on is when I was in Southend, I was involved in setting up the first artist-led project space there. This is a long, long time ago, and it's got some other things going on now as well, which is really great. It's had a bit of a new lease of life, but so, and I've kind of worked on various like artist-led projects like that over the years, and part of it for me and the people that I was working with, like Stu, who you saw in the talk, and I think a big part of it was about just making sure that we still do these things, even without the kind of not waiting for like a gallery to come along and ask to show us, or not waiting for any kind of infrastructure. We were trying to be sort of quite proactive and do things on the front foot. And also, I kind of hoped that by bringing a show like Odds to Toma, you know, maybe some of the Toma people might feel really excited to, you know, make their own projects happen in a kind of similar vein to that or something. So I guess what I'm saying is I don't see myself as being this kind of like institution with the shows that I'm organising in that sense. I just think everyone should be doing it.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
That wasn't meant to be a rant, by the way. That was just supposed to be like encouraging or something. Yeah.
I think now more than ever, you know, that people should just be. There's so many conversations going on about, you know, how institutions are failing artists, and everyone should be, you know, getting support from the institutions. And I'm just like, there's going to be loads of empty buildings. Like, just team up, go for it. Just, you know, and all this funding structures and stuff, almost just kind of forget it. You know, just
yeah.
Take
but also,
over.
you know, pre-COVID, that was a problem with like the decline of the high street and everything, and the fact that all these business rates are just so expensive for high street shops. And Southend High Street, just as one example, is like, you know, they renovated it. They put in like a really, you know, like a much nicer kind of like, I don't know what, you know, they kind of retiled the floor.
Still looks awful.
Well, okay, yeah, it doesn't look, but it looks better than it did probably. I can't actually remember what it looked like before, but what I'm saying is that a lot of those shops are just completely empty, and it's like, you know, and then Toma sort of struggling with their you know, paying the business rates on their space and this kind of thing, and I think it's been
they can't afford to pay the heating.
Is that Dave Watkins?
Yeah, hello.
I can't see you, but nice to hear your voice. What did you say? Something about heating.
Oh yeah, Toma, they can't afford to pay the heating. They've got a free space, but they can't afford the heating.
Right, yeah.
Which probably doesn't matter now, but
yeah, but it does in the winter.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So when we were in Senegal, who got the wrong paint colour? Was it me or you?
I don't remember, to be honest.
I remember I just dictated the way one piece of artwork went, because we brought one that said white, and I think it may be me.
Yeah, that's
I
right.
opened it was like, it's
red,
blue, John, it's blue, help, what can I do?
I mean, there's a lot of sharing goes on in environments like that, isn't there?
Yeah, it was good fun.
Yeah, that's funny.
Okay, any last comments or questions from anyone? If everyone could unmute themselves, we'll just give Jon a massive round of applause. And thank you so much, Jon, for speaking for us.
Thanks, John.
Yay!